How concerned are you about China's debt?
China, of course, has been the poster child for increasing debt post-financial crisis. Now, debt, of course, is a real problem if it works as advertised. That is, it's a hard claim, and because it cannot be easily negotiated, if somebody gets into distress, it spills across the system. Now, what China has, which, for example, wasn't as easy in the US, is the government can allocate losses a lot more than, for example, it can in the United States. So even though the bankruptcy system is not as effective, the ability of the government to say, hey, you extend this loan and don't demand that it be paid back now, because a lot of the money flows through the public sector system in China, it has some of that ability. Now, eventually they want a market system to work. So they have to move away from this sense that they can fix the system when it gets into trouble. They have to let the market do a lot more. But at least at this point, they have that ability and they're using some of it. For example, these special purpose vehicles that the local governments have issued, which were running into trouble, their debt has been extended almost by fiat.
What about China's need to maybe move away more significantly from export-led growth to domestic-led growth? And on some level, that's what the Trump team's complaint is.
Yeah. Well, that is in some sense, China's goal also, to move away from export-led growth towards domestic demand-led growth. You can see it that there are some factors which are helping that. For example, Chinese wages have been picking up. When Chinese households have more income, they will have more to spend. Domestic demand will pick up more. Chinese consumption to GDP is picking up slowly off, from the depths it had reached. It had reached very low levels. Now, that said, I think one of the bigger fears of the Trump administration is not so much that export-led growth policy will continue, but that the Chinese presence in certain industries will pick up significantly more, especially in the high-tech areas. So the view is if China does what it did in steel and aluminum in other industries, such as artificial intelligence, such as chip manufacturing, such as aircraft manufacturing, then whatever advantage the US had will evaporate because it'll get shut out of those businesses.
Well, we know one of the reasons that China climbed so rapidly starting back in the 80s was that they did peg their exchange rate. And even though that violated WTO rules, no one really pushed hard. Now people are starting to push harder, particularly on intellectual property. Is there legitimate concern that China will tell you what it's going to do and knows what it needs to do, but will continue to do what it most needs to do, which is to keep growing its economy, whether it's exports, domestic demand, or whatever it has to do?
Well, I do think that there was a legitimate concern then about the exchange rate. I think today the exchange rate is no longer the concern. It's a more market-driven exchange rate. Of course, there is concern about subsidies that are given to these industries, about China's respect for intellectual property and whether in fact there has been intellectual property transfer either by coercion by the government. You have to share your intellectual property if you want to do business here, or whether private parties are stealing intellectual property. But I really think that there is also a difference in what China is doing, which should make the US feel a little more confident. Much easier to grow when you're in the industries which are not at the frontier, because the path for growth for aluminum, steel, etc. is very clear. It doesn't take rocket science. What they need now is rocket science. They are at the frontier. AI needs rockets. Now the Chinese are developing their own capabilities here, and that's important. That's valuable to the world. But I think it's not going to be as easy in the past. So I'm not saying there is no reason for concern in industrial countries, but I think there are partnerships, there are ways of making this work much better. And it's not, it shouldn't be driven primarily by a fear of China. I think it's going to be harder for China to stay at the frontiers in these areas. There is room for a win-win discussion.